Lecture 15. The 15th of July 1958. Ladies and gentlemen, in the last session we spoke about the Cartesian demand that our intellectual procedure must be careful not to leave out any steps, and I attempted to show you in what sense this Cartesian axiom is actually incompatible with the approach of dialectical thought. Now Hegel was certainly not the first to express specific resistance to this procedure, and indeed a very important French conservative philosopher, de Maistre, had already parodied the old Baconian critique of idols, which was revived during the 18th century, and spoken in this connection of the idol Dialectics, that is, the idol of the ladder, the notion that we must always proceed step by step, that thought is never allowed to take off, which basically implies that thought may not run ahead of itself, that thought may not bring anything to bear beyond what it already has anyway. We could almost say, echoing the paradox of the flying arrow, that the rigorously applied Cartesian demand for an entirely seamless and continuous form of thought would inevitably end up in pure tautology. But it is not so much this which strikes me as essential here, although objectively speaking it seems to me to furnish an emphatic critique of any thought which can only proceed step by step. Rather, the moment which dialectic rebels against, at least dialectic as I believe I may understand it, and indeed as I think on closer inspection it was also deployed by Hegel himself specifically in the phenomenology of spirit, is the coercive character of thought. We have the concept of what is logically compelling, namely an operation, which leaves nothing out, where there is no possibility of escaping the conclusion, and we have what psychology describes with the concept of the compulsive character, namely a human being subjected to forms of ritualistic behavior, inflexibly bound to the notion of order and incapable of genuine freedom. But there is nonetheless a remarkably powerful affinity between these two concepts of compulsion, between merely logical compulsion and the psychological compulsion to ritualistic behavior, as we may observe, for example, from Ludwig Thom's Die kleinen Verwandten, a play which I saw when I was very young and which made an unforgettable impression on me. In the play, a station inspector from Großschubach pays an unexpected visit to relatives of his, academics by profession, who are on the point of finding a suitable husband for their young daughter. They now make fruitless efforts to get rid of their provincial relative, lest he endanger the delicate marriage project, but he keeps on insisting that everything must be identified in its proper category. I have never forgotten this image of someone who has to bring everything under a stable category, and, when I later came to read Kant and his deduction of the categories, I was never completely able to dispel that image of the station inspector from Großschubach. I will not try and decide here whether this is Kant's fault or my own. This implies a particular kind of obligation on the part of dialectical thought, and one which probably accounts for the resistance to such thought that we shall discuss in more detail here. For dialectical thinking is obliged to show a specific kind of mobility, namely a refusal to be nailed down precisely to that particular point, to be confined or compelled to remain at that particular point, where the chosen object or form of argumentation currently finds itself. This already became clear to me at a time when I was still far from relating these dialectical reflections, relating dialectical philosophy itself, to the actual practice of own thinking with the radicality that I hope I shall gradually be able to achieve. At the time I had published a considerable number of theoretical pieces on musical questions, but I immediately realized that these theoretical reflections on music, which still obeyed the principle of immanence, namely the principle of immanent and thus above all technical critique, thereby ran the danger of assuming a narrowly specialized or even academic character. And a Viennese friend of mine once told me that a certain kind of strictly technical immanent analysis always reminded him of the way they approached art in Horak's music school, an institution of great strictness and pedantry, which nonetheless succeeded in maintaining sub-branches in many parts of the city. Now I wanted to avoid the danger of thinking in the style of Horak's music school, so I experimented by producing reflections and considerations on music which I described in both a literal and a metaphorical sense as music from the outside. I understood this in the literal sense of not hearing music as it sounds in the concert hall or the opera house, for example, but rather of hearing what an opera sounds like if we fail to return to our seats after the interval and then simply perceive all this noise from outside, of seeing what this noise tells us from outside. And I had the feeling that this brings out a side of music that we otherwise overlook, and what struck me here, in more general terms, was that we can really say something about a phenomenon only if, in a sense, we also look at it from the outside rather than solely from the inside, that is, if we also consider it within the social context in which it stands. And I believe, as if in obedience to that famous darkling aspiration, that I was not just seeking to combine the view from outside with the view from inside in order to produce a so-called synthesis of both. For I was already vaguely aware that, while these two perspectives do belong to one another and stand in a certain tension with one another, they cannot be collapsed together. And, when I talk about the mobility of thought with regard to the phenomenon, what I mean to say is precisely that one must consider the phenomenon both from within, in terms of its own demands, its own origin, its own principles, and also indeed from without, in terms of the functional context in which it stands, the side which it turns to human beings, its meaning it specifically assumes for the life of human beings. And I may remind you that it is quite conceivable, and indeed highly likely, that works of art of the greatest stature, works which in themselves are anything but mere ideology and are actually, as Hegel would say, a form in which truth appears, can nonetheless become ideology through the role which they assume within the prevailing cultural industry today. Thus you can perhaps see that it makes good sense to pursue these two perspectives, the immanent and the transcendent approaches, independently of one another in a certain way, and simply trust that, if our thought penetrates both aspects deeply enough, the relationship between them will reveal itself after all, a trust which, I must admit, I have never been able to relinquish to this day. This double-edged character of thought, which must therefore be at once within the matter and outside of it, and which is also involved in the method pursued by Hegel in the phenomenology of spirit, this very double-edged character of thought expresses something essential to dialectical thought, and it is only for that reason, and not for the sake of some passing aperçu, that I am talking about this idea of the mobility of thought here today. For dialectical thinking does indeed imply the unremitting effort to bring together the universal and the particular, the hic et nunc and its concept, while remaining aware that there is no immediate or unmediated identity between these moments and that, indeed, they diverge from one another. I would say that the epistemological dialectical place of what I have called the mobility of thought, in contrast to all merely inductive or merely deductive intellectual procedures, is precisely the attempt of thought, now abiding with itself, now moving beyond itself, ultimately to bring the knowing subject that approaches from without together with the movement of the matter itself. This is something which is necessarily involved in the dialectical method. And, if we distinguish these things, if we refrain from seeking any blank identity between them, if we are able, on the contrary, to alternate these genera, as it were, if such alternation is the very color of dialectical thought, this does not simply spring from an artistic nature which is incapable of thinking in any other way. It is because this is actually the color of dialectic itself, the color of a kind of thinking that unites identity and non-identity. But it is clear that, specifically with regard to this aspect which I have just described for you so suspiciously, as I might put it, so suspiciously precisely because so seductively, it is obvious that the strongest possible resistance will instantly be provoked. When it is claimed that this is a privileged form of thought available only to those who are particularly fitted for it, one that certainly cannot be translated without more ado into a universally binding method, this is the most innocuous form of resistance that I have mentioned. The much more widespread suspicion regarding the mobility of thought arises from the charge that such thought effectively avoids responsibility, that it is a slippery and unreliable form of thinking which eludes our grasp, which we cannot hold down, and thus really evades any firm decision about what is true or false. If we remember the fundamental reflections about the true and the false which we have already presented, the first thing to say is that even this, which I have just expressed in a rather crass manner, is actually not so inapplicable to the concept of dialectic. For a single individual judgment, taken in isolation, is indeed neither absolutely true nor absolutely false, and the truth is actually nothing but the path that leads precisely through the falseness of our individual judgments. All the same, given that philosophy and science always also play a part in the power struggles between individuals, groups, states, classes, nations, and so on, a certain suspicion is naturally appropriate at this point. For if our thought is only mobile enough, if we relinquish real argument rather than just refusing to be bound by it in a rigid manner, as we suggested here, then we may be tempted to do what Socrates, the ancient practitioner of dialectic, was specifically accused of doing, acute, or making the weaker word appear the stronger, like the nimble and well-oiled wrestler who can defeat his stronger and simpler opponent, or like the clever talker who knows precisely how to cheat the peasant out of his cows. Now this ancient objection to the sophistical appearance of dialectic, which I mentioned by way of anticipation right at the beginning of these lectures, is not to be taken slightly, and we cannot of course deny that dialectic, and especially certain dialectical forms of argumentation, can indeed degenerate into this kind of evasion we have mentioned. You will repeatedly discover that the more differentiated our critical intellectual reflections become, the less rigidly they unfold, the more variables they thereby take up into themselves, the more they must also forfeit stringency in the traditional sense, and the more they are thereby exposed to the danger which I have just outlined for you. And it is specifically philosophical discussions on the highest level which generally prove especially vulnerable to this danger. In the first place, I would say that this danger can only really be allayed by that freedom with regard to the object which Hegel asked for, in the sense that any practice of philosophy, and especially critical philosophy, is legitimate only as long as it is reflective about itself, and that also means as long as it does not demand to be in the right. We could almost say, with due exaggeration, that the renunciation of this demand is a criterion of the truth of thought itself, that in a sense thought must set itself in the wrong, though in a way that convicts the very demand to be in the right of its narrow and limited character. But this on its own is hardly enough, for I believe that what strongly emerges here is precisely what I described a couple of sessions ago, in a way that may well seem paradoxical and surprising to several of you, as the positivistic element in dialectical thought, an element, incidentally, which in a sense was also emphasized by Benjamin in his vindication of induction in the preface to his work The Origin of German Tragic Drama. The only way of meeting the chronic danger of that which is involved the mobility of thought, it seems to me, is an extraordinary obligation to expose ourselves to the object in its specificity. Thus, if we are talking about particular epistemological questions, I would say that it is a false argument, or a false kind of dialectic, If we tried to direct the discussion by claiming that specific motifs which have already been subjected to criticism in this connection nonetheless possess a good, useful, respectable or positive function for their part within the totality of the form of thought in question, for in that case we should simply keep to the original epistemological problematic. The path of dialectic, which attempts to move beyond the specialist and highly circumscribed perspective of logic and epistemology, would be one which did not content itself with simply identifying the point which requires criticism and then declaring, "Look, there is a mistake in the reasoning here, you have got yourself entangled in contradiction, the whole thing is therefore worthless." Rather, the next step would be to show why, within the constellation of such thinking, the relevant mistakes and contradictions inevitably arise, what has motivated them within the movement of such thought, and thus how far they reveal themselves, in the total context of thought, to be significant in their own falsehood and contradictoriness. This is actually the most important thing one can learn about the discipline of dialectical thought. Since dialectical thinking does not start from any rigid concepts, from a rigid system, from any rigid givens, but is eminently required to abandon itself to the matter itself, it can only really avoid the danger of that relativism, that arbitrariness, that spurious flexibility of which we have spoken if it takes that obligation towards the individual object not more loosely but indeed more seriously than the usual sciences and our usual habits of thought typically do, if it immerses itself in individual problems with an incomparably greater seriousness than conventional thinking ever allows. Now if you ask me here for some kind of rule for how to proceed in this regard, for how to accomplish this, you will only embarrass me, for I can offer you no such general rule, and that would indeed be to demand too much of dialectical thought. All I can say to you, where dialectical thought is required to explore any specific object, is that we must expressly reflect whether we have tarried long enough with the latter, whether we have looked at it so closely that it begins of its own accord to come alive, or whether we have contented ourselves merely with the conventional cast, as it were, with the stereotypical pre-given concepts of the thing in question. I would like to take this opportunity to point out that I have no intention of simply recommending dialectic to you here as the best method of thinking. Dialectical thinking is indeed the best. This is a slogan, but it is not the truth. Dialectical thought as such can of course be misused for any conceivable mischief in the world just as much as any other form of thought, and if it possesses any advantage on this level I would say it is this, precisely as a method of mobility and continual self-reflection, it may involve a moment that makes us rather more alert and skeptical in relation to such misuse or in relation to the obtuseness of traditional thought than is generally the case. The suspicion which dialectic encounters at this point, the general suspicion with regard to the mobility of thought, is itself grounded in social factors. Such mobile thinking is generally identified with relativism, with a refusal to acknowledge anything determinate or firmly established at all, instead of seeing that the movement of such thought proceeds precisely by taking what is determinate and firmly established even more seriously. This is exactly the domain where the dialectical approach is accused of being essentially ungrounded, of offering us nothing established to hold on to, of representing a form of thought that only ever deprives us of something without giving anything back. The tacit assumption here is already the affirmative one that thought, rather than abandoning itself to the matter itself, is supposed to fulfill a particular psychological function, to set us on firm ground or to warm our hearts, just as sentimental heart-warming literature does. And what is commonly described as a Weltanschauung or worldview, which can never be distinguished too strongly from genuine philosophical thought, is indeed intimately related to the sphere of heart-warming literature, even where the content of such literature assumes the form of Buddhistic pessimism. That matters little in this connection. And it is already quite wrong to demand that philosophy give us anything at all in this sense. For it is we who must give something to philosophy, namely everything, our entire conscious experience, and we must be prepared to enter into rather questionable kinds of speculation, while recognizing that, in return for what we give in this regard, we may well not receive back what is commonly expected of philosophy. This approach naturally arises from the circumstance, if I may introduce a sociological excursus here, that the more rural parts or agricultural sectors of the population must usually pay the price of progress in that universal advance of rationalization, which indeed increasingly undermines the merely direct connection of human experience and thought to the realm of nature. These parts of the population, therefore, rather than radicalizing the idea of progress itself to the point where they too would receive justice for themselves, tend to lay the blame on this principle of mobility, as if the itinerant peddlers were to blame for the increasing poverty of the peasantry, selling them pitiful wares for a pitiful return. I am not sure whether such peddlers still exist today, but I think it would be better for us philosophers to confess that we do have something of the peddler about us than to sport old-fashioned costume and betake ourselves to the mountains in the style of the settler who still knows all the train times, as Diggers wonderfully put it. That is all for now regarding the charge of groundlessness. The assumption that thought should always stand on firm ground, that it must never be deprived of such ground under any circumstances, is essentially bound up with that notion of a given absolutely first principle, of the primacy of such a ground or principle, which we have already criticized. Dialectical thought must confront this issue. There is no such ground for philosophy, at least not for philosophy today, any more than contemporary society can still be grasped on the basis of its supposedly natural foundations, any more than agriculture is still crucial for contemporary society. For here the truth itself is a dynamic truth, where the primordial moments, as they say, do still also appear as moments of the archaic, as moments of memory, or however you want to describe them, but not as something to which any higher substantial meaning could be ascribed from the metaphysical, moral or logical point of view. The core of thought, that which is actually substantial in thought, that which allows it to show its truth and makes it more than merely empty talk, this core is not the unshakable ground on which it stands, nor is it some reified detachable thesis to which we might point and say, well then, there it is, that is what it has to say, there it stands, it can do no other, God help this thought. These are all notions about the content of philosophy, which have sprung from considerations of conscience, from the need to show our colors, which generally suggests that the only true and responsible thought for those who profess it is one which can be called to justify at every suitable opportunity by the relevant boards and commissions. In other words, all this effectively implies the denial of that moment of intellectual freedom which provides the essential climate for the dynamic exploration of philosophical thought. For the core substance of thinking is the latent power from which thought is ultimately drawn, the light which falls upon things through thought, which is not itself thing-like, not some reified object to which one has to swear allegiance. This is the ideal, for which truth ultimately depends on the demand that thought must be able at any and every moment to justify the ground on which it stands and the reified core that forms its content. Whereas we have to recognize that this substantial moment is something that stands behind thought, a source of power rather than something like a thesis, something we could just repeat or take into possession merely by a process of checking or control. I have no wish to impugn the notion of methodical control, and I think you will already have recognized that. The conceptions of dialectic which I am trying to unfold for you here really have nothing to do with a kind of wild and unbridled thinking which has simply forgotten everything that critical philosophy has developed in the way of methodical control. Dialectical thought cannot possibly proceed in this way, since it emerges strictly from critical thought, is itself nothing but philosophical critique brought to its most acute point of self-awareness. But I would specifically like to remind you that the concept of philosophy which we are trying to develop here is not a merely isolated or specialist one, but one which is meant to be significant for the vital concerns of your own work. And thus I would like to point out that this concept of methodical or intellectual control, which certainly plays a very important role with regard to dialectical thought, has itself undergone considerable changes over the course of time. Now the idea of such methodical control, and indeed with potential reference to all individuals and all questions, namely to everyone who shares the faculty of reason, was originally intended to liberate thought from all dogmatic tutelage, was simply designed to prevent human beings from submitting to arbitrary claims of any kind. It was directed above all against certain fundamental theological arguments which appeal to miracles, and the possibility of rational or empirical control was most emphatically asserted in this regard. But today the concept of intellectual control has largely, I will not say absolutely, but largely, reversed its original function. For today it effectively amounts to preventing a nonconformist form of thought which cannot simply be translated into a step-by-step approach to knowledge, namely into a development of what is already given, a form of thought which cannot just be reproduced by anyone whatsoever and at any time whatsoever. The principle of the gradual acquisition of knowledge basically amounts to the idea that we can only ever think what is already known with constant variations, as it were, in a process of infinitesimal transition to the new. And this idea negates those fractures in truth and knowledge which are rooted in the fractures of the world itself and which furnish the content of genuine knowledge as such. In view of the danger that I seem to be contradicting certain democratic rules of the game where knowledge is concerned, I should perhaps say here that even in the Universitas Literarum, in the Republic of the Learned, the notion that everyone must check every thought, at least in their own professional field, that the truth or dignity of an intellectual achievement must be judged in each case by the number of positive recommendations that have been garnered from professional colleagues, strikes me as extraordinarily problematic. For the consciousness to which we actually appeal here as a criterion of truth is for its part a consciousness that has already been shaped by the mechanisms of social accommodation, and one which tends in many cases to excise what is actually essential to thought. But of course there is also no guarantee that a nonconformist thought is necessarily true, for, precisely through the kind of intellectual control which has now become universal, everything which escapes it tends in turn to assume an apocryphal or rather far-fetched character, and indeed in extreme cases, such as that of the originally highly gifted and recently deceased psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich, may ultimately come to appear paranoiac or even fraudulent. In our current situation we are actually confronted with a very grave antinomy. On the one hand, thought is consumed in the blind repetition of what exists and is known anyway, namely in conformity, and, on the other, thought which eludes methodical control thereby runs the danger of becoming uncontrollable in any sense and effectively falling into delusion. And this tendency is surely not the least innocuous of those symptoms of intellectual dissociation and collective schizophrenia which we can observe today in so many areas of our life, and one that deserves, it seems to me, to be taken with extraordinary seriousness. The truly new, by contrast, is thus always a qualitative leap, to use Hegel's language, a qualitative leap not in the sense of a kind of thought which leaps anywhere, but in the sense of a leap which is produced by persistent exposure to the object itself. And, Expressed in these terms, this approach stands in inevitable contrast, in extreme contrast, to the adoption of some quite new or quite different standpoint. When I spoke earlier about the mobility of thought and, if you like, defended this mobility, I should perhaps add, in order to protect this especially vulnerable thought from misunderstanding, that mobility of thought here does not mean a constant readiness to change what is generally described as a standpoint. Rather, it refers to a self-reflective change in the approach of thought, depending on whether it is to relate to the context in which the particular stands or to the particular itself. But the essence of philosophy, and I believe that the important philosophers specifically since Hegel are actually all agreed on this, seems to lie precisely in the repudiation of anything like the concept of a standpoint, although this is exactly what defines the popular notion of philosophy as a kind of worldview. Thus, in place of some such externally introduced standpoint, what is involved here is actually the compelling movement of the matter itself, something which is also captured in the Cartesian doctrine of a gradual advance from one point to another. The movement of thought, the dynamic moment of thought, is also contained in that Cartesian axiom which we criticized earlier. If I omitted any reference to this positive aspect here, that is because I regard this as almost self-evident. Descartes himself also knew, of course, that knowledge is essentially a process rather than a merely immediate kind of recognition. It is just that he could only grasp the movement of thought which he saw and articulated, and this is precisely the bourgeois aspect which strikes me as untrue here in the image of what is static and rigid, and the symbol of the ladder which appears in this connection, and which was mocked by de Maistre, is itself the sign that even what is dynamic appears only in congealed form here. This dynamic itself appears as if it were thing-like and immobile, as a freezing of movement into something static, and this has somehow always been inscribed in philosophy in the most remarkable fashion, even in its most dynamic representatives from Heraclitus through to Hegel. And if there is one decisive sense in which dialectical thought must move beyond Hegel himself, then it is surely here at the very point I have described. Lecture 16. The 17th of July 1958. Ladies and gentlemen, today I would like to turn to the last of the Cartesian postulates and its relation to dialectical thought, namely the postulate of completeness, and thus the problem of system. This is a problem which has certainly not received sufficient attention in the course of our reflections so far, although there is no question, if we take the idea of the power of the whole and the particular with the full weight and seriousness it deserves, that the idea of system as ultimately the sole guarantee of truth cannot be eliminated at least from the Hegelian conception of dialectic. And here I would just like to draw your attention to the question which we shall have to consider very seriously during these last sessions, and one for which I shall certainly not be able to offer you any straightforward solution. The question is this: what happens to the concept of dialectic once the concept of system has become seriously problematic? The fourth of Descartes' axioms and his last rule was in all cases to make enumerations so complete and reviews so general that I should be certain of having omitted nothing. Now I believe that, if you want a really vivid idea of what should properly be understood by rationalism, a vivid idea of that moment which the subsequent and especially Kantian critique of rationalism described as its dogmatic element, you can recognize this in a nutshell, and in very concrete form, in this particular proposition of Descartes, and without actually having to mull over those general features which are said to characterize the basic philosophical schools. For this demand already betrays an entirely dogmatic assumption which does not actually appear intelligible at all. This is the assumption that, in order really to possess that completeness which Descartes regards as the authentic criterion of binding truth, you can be quite sure that all of the elements which you are dealing with and have to reckon with are also in fact completely known to you. But this assumption is actually valid only under very specific conditions, such as those which are perhaps most obviously provided by mathematics. Now, I do not wish to get involved in fundamental questions of mathematics here. And I believe since the introduction of set theory in particular that things are by no means so simple in the realm of mathematics either. At any rate, even from the mathematical point of view, we can say that this axiom of completeness can tacitly be assumed only where we are dealing with definite manifolds. Furthermore, we may say that, in general, the pursuit of knowledge can follow this procedure only if it has a guarantee that, apart from the elements involved, the axiom of completeness, no further elements will emerge for knowledge, or if it has decided, arbitrarily as it were, to cut off the possibility of any further elements emerging, and has thus contented itself in advance with the order of what is already there. In other words, if you apply the axiom of completeness beyond the extremely narrow mathematical domain in which it was conceived, then you are dealing with a reification of knowledge in a precise sense, which I can perhaps clarify for you with this example, now that we have already employed the concept of reification rather frequently. For here we find a third term, as it were, that intrudes between knowledge itself and the object of knowledge, a sort of order or principle which is arbitrarily imposed upon the matter itself from the side of the subject, a kind of schematism, we might say, which disturbs the immediate experience, the immediate relationship, of knowledge to its object, and which, if you like, actually arrests that relationship. Thus this principle of completeness, which is indeed clearly identical with the principle of an all-embracing system, can meaningfully be applied only when it has already been decided, through an arbitrary cognitive act, that our knowledge may reach this far and no further, that a certain order can then be established in material which has been prepared through this regulated conceptual process. If you do not enter this qualification, if you do not therefore observe this demand for completeness, then the axiom of completeness actually becomes a mere dogma. That is to say, it is assumed as a binding truth that the knowing mind could be certain in and of itself. In an almost magical way, we should have to say that all the elements whose unity it is supposed to establish, and which knowledge is supposed to encompass, are also in fact already given to us in a complete and seamless fashion. If you like, you can regard the efforts of post-Kantian German idealism, and paradoxically even the efforts of Hegel himself, as an attempt to resolve this dilemma, to confront this extraordinary difficulty, in the following way. The material that presents itself to be known, which we cannot initially be sure is capable of being incorporated within a fully systematic context, is itself spun out of consciousness, as it were, and the attempt is made to deduce from consciousness that in which such order is subsequently supposed to be exhibited. Thus, in a certain sense, the radical intention of German idealism, of resolving objectivity entirely into subjectivity, or, more precisely put, of resolving all that exists entirely into the absolute character of spirit, could find its justification precisely in terms of this systematic requirement, that is to say, in the requirement which is stipulated by Descartes here in a merely dogmatic manner, the idea of justifying this kind of completeness through the constructive process of knowledge, through the way the theory of knowledge itself is grounded, namely the idea of determining knowledge itself as something which in a sense is entirely independent of what would simply be out there, as something which takes up everything into itself for the simple reason that it ultimately produces everything out of itself. But then this gives rise to the difficulty, as we are thrown from Scylla to Charybdis as it were, which is what knowledge is really supposed to mean, what we can really be said to know, if the sum of knowledge as such is nothing but the sum of what is already known. In other words, The question is whether this strictly realized identity does not actually transform all knowledge into a single tautology, and whether by thus merely repeating itself it does not actually frustrate what it set out to achieve, namely the knowledge of something with which it is not itself identical. Hegel also tried to resolve this problem, as I have already suggested to you, by asserting the non-identity, the persisting distinction of subject and object, in every individual moment, and by making this specific contradiction, namely the non-identity of the judgment and the thing which it intends, and thus the inevitable failure of the individual judgment which affirms such an identity, into the motor which drives the individual judgment beyond itself and thus ultimately constitutes the system itself in a comprehensive sense. I do not wish to go into this idea any further here, but would prefer to say something to you about the way in which dialectical thought should proceed if it remains critically aware of the problems which arise at this point, and if it no longer dogmatically stipulates the completeness of all the elements involved in knowledge. Since we can never be sure of the completeness of our knowledge if we cannot say whether new elements of knowledge will not constantly emerge in what is already given, for every object harbors an infinite wealth of aspects, and there is no need to add anything new here precisely because the matter itself offers infinite newness in every moment. How are we to respond if we are not to proceed in a simply non-conceptual manner, if we are not simply to surrender in a bluntly empirical way to everything new in each particular case, if we do not actually wish to renounce knowledge altogether? Now I would say that, while we should not strive for completeness of knowledge, neither should we of course simply isolate our individual cognitive acts, merely registering things in a static and thus unconnected form which lacks any relationship to the whole. And dialectic is a trick, if you can forgive me this looser mode of expression, or perhaps at least an attempt to square the circle which this problem presents to you. Just as dialectic as a whole is essentially the attempt to resolve the paradox of identity and non-identity not just by coming to a standstill here but by unfolding and advancing through these elements. I would therefore say that the authentic task of philosophical thought is to furnish certain models rather than trying to embrace everything, rather than yielding to the chimerical demand not to leave anything out. Something which is closely related anyway to that pedantic petty bourgeois need for absolutely continuous step-by-step conception of thought which I described for you during the last session. Philosophy should effectively be concerned with constructing models, and, if I express this last time by saying that the substance of philosophy, the substance of thought, lies not in its supposed theses or its individual propositions, but in the source of illumination which stands behind this thought and falls upon the individual objective moments in each case. This also applies to what I am saying to you at this moment. This source of illumination, this cone of light, falls in fact upon individual and specific objects which it brings out. Here, if you like, it indeed resembles positivism, but does so in such a way that the cognition of the particular thing also casts light, or is reflected in turn, upon all other objects which there are. In contrast to the merely limited sort of correctness which is involved in procedures of identification and observation, I would say that the criterion of philosophical truth lies in how far it is capable of moving from something specific already known to us to shed further light upon a range of other things, lies in how far the activity of knowing is driven onwards from this center of cognitive force. It is this cognitive intention which allows illumination to transpire from the perspective of particular knowledge, rather than mere subsumption under a cover concept which has effectively been shaped by an administrative mentality. That seems to me to be the essential concern of philosophy. Perhaps it is worth pointing out that what I am saying to you here, and which may strike some of you as rather audacious, can in a sense also be found in the theories of knowledge defended by two of the most influential thinkers of the previous generation, who were also aware that, while the traditional conception of system was indeed inadequate, the mere subsumption of the individual under general concepts, namely the mere classification of what happens to be given, was certainly not sufficient either. I am thinking of two thinkers who have very little connection with one another in terms of their influence and their explicit intellectual positions, but whose teachings I would like to touch upon for a moment here precisely in order to show you that what I have just formulated for you in a very extreme way is not some impulse that has fallen straight from heaven, as it were, but is something that is already very clearly prefigured, at least is a potential, in the context of contemporary thought. I am referring here to the concept of ideal type in the work of Max Weber and to the concept of essence developed by Edmund Husserl and subsequently extended by the phenomenological movement to specific material areas of experience. Now the concept of ideal type in Max Weber is an attempt to manage without system, and indeed Max Weber possessed no system. And you will not find a general overarching concept of society itself in the entire theory presented in his Economy and Society. Nonetheless, Max Weber felt the need to move beyond any merely isolating form of scientific observation, and his conception of Vestian or understanding is itself an anti-positivist concept, and one which was also criticized by other sociologists. For indeed to understand something already means that we have not allowed it to stand simply as a factum, as a mere factum, since, precisely by understanding it, by discovering meaning in it, I render it intelligible in relation to something else, something which it itself is not. Now it is in this connection that Max Weber introduces the remarkable concept of ideal type, which is then supposed, once it is concretely developed, to indicate the universal context in which the particular falls, without thereby claiming that this relationship actually exists. For this is supposed to be a purely heuristic device, that is, it is supposed to allow individual phenomena, such as individual forms of economy, to be compared with capitalism as an ideal type, and thus to be conceptually articulated in turn. And once the ideal type has fulfilled this organizing role, and perhaps even been refuted by the facts, it can be relinquished or can now just go, like Schiller's famous more once he has done his duty. And the number of ideal types is in principle infinite, for I can form as many ideal types as I wish, according to Weber. The purpose of such types is solely the practical scientific one of providing a means of organization. You can clearly see here how he attempted to deploy a type of thinking which comes extraordinarily close to the concept of model I have introduced in this context. It is just that he did nonetheless basically retain a certain positivist conception, since for him the universal, in relation to the particular, is ultimately nothing but an abbreviated expression of characteristic features, and he completely fails to see how the universal essentially inhabits the particular, which is precisely what we have been trying to grasp here in specific epistemological terms. Thus this ray of cognition, which sees what is ultimately essential in the phenomenon, becomes a merely ancillary operation in which no trust is actually placed. Something entirely without substance, since its object, the encompassing universal itself, is supposed to be without substance, and the model in question is relinquished after all. In other words, the concept of model as a weighty epistemological category is effectively replaced in Max Weber by a dialectical model of knowledge which reflects the perspective of traditional logic. And we find something comparable, if you like, in the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl, at least in this regard, for there are indeed countless other facets to phenomenology which cannot be considered here. For Husserl believes that with an individual object I am able to intuit its essence, its pure qualities, that which makes it precisely what it is, through a process of leaving out the effectively contingent aspects of the object, and that I can do this without referring to a multiplicity of objects of the same kind and without abstracting the element they have in common. And he quite rightly realized that the concept which allows the individual thing to be illuminated, which allows us to grasp it in its essential character, to grasp it precisely as it is, that this concept is not the same as the ordering concept under which a series of objects can be encompassed in terms of a merely formal unity. It is just that Husserl too, like Weber, shrank back from the decisive step towards dialectic insofar as he also remained oriented to traditional logic, insofar as he effectively conceives what I intuit in and through the individual object, the essence that is illuminated for me, the model, as it were, in which the individual object appears to me, once again as nothing but the universal concept of that object. He had no other notion of essence itself than the universal concept under which individual objects can be grasped, and simply believed that, in a mode of cognition that resembles a model, this universal reveals itself to me in and through the particular. But this universality for its part was still understood in terms of the usual classificatory logic, with the result that his own theory of essences got caught up in the greatest difficulties, since this universal, the ordering class concept in which the individual moments are included, is of course precisely what I can never intuit out of the individual thing. If you consider for a moment this concept of model which I have tried to suggest to you here, the attempt to let the illumination of particular moments cast its light upon other things in turn, and if you try to think this concept further, you will immediately recognize an essential feature of these models which philosophy undertakes to develop. And I must confess here that everything that I do in the way of philosophy, every word that I publish, is not some attempt to deal exhaustively with a certain field, but solely an attempt to develop models which could indeed cast a distinctive light upon an entire field, a light that also alters and determines the entire field in a particular way. And in all of my own contributions, whether they are good for anything or not, I always orient myself very strictly by this concept of models. You'll recognize that this concept of models only possesses any meaning if it successfully forfeits its mere isolation, if it really also points beyond itself, if in some way it redeems the claim that the particular that has been illuminated here is itself something universal. And the question of how we redeem the claim of particular and specific cognition to a certain universality, that, I would say, is the specific problem of knowledge which dialectical thought must confront today. But if we do not wish our individual models simply to stand side by side in an isolated and unconnected manner like so many little pictures, which was once a critical objection to phenomenology, and one could also say the same for Weber's idea types, this cannot be accomplished by bringing these models under some overall concept, such as a worldview or a general position, or again by gathering them into some supposedly systematic form, by fitting them into a system. I would say that the requisite communication between them is best accomplished not by bringing them all under a common denominator, but by sinking subterranean passages, as it were, or by somehow opening doors into these subterranean passages from each individual instance of knowledge. In this way these models can connect with one another, indeed connect subterraneously, as I would like to put it, without this interconnection being imposed upon them by the arbitrary demands of organizational thought. The interconnection here must emerge out of the complexion of the matter itself, and is something over which the thinker has no actual power. And I would almost say that it is a further criterion of truth, an indication of the wealth and binding character of knowledge, whether this communication of the individual models is produced in and through itself, as it were, or can only be produced in an external superficial manner. If I once wrote that it is a genuine indication of trustworthy work that draws forth its requisite quotations spontaneously, as it were, that it tempts them to come forward of themselves, This is precisely what I was trying to capture. Thus I would say that the interconnection of thought, the interconnection of knowledge achieved through such models, which actually accomplishes what earlier ages had once expected from the idea of system, that such interconnection displays the character of a labyrinth rather than that of a system. And I once formulated a claim which those of you who have read these things must surely have found rather shocking, or at least highly thought-provoking, and it is this: true thoughts are those alone which do not understand themselves. And it is very easy just to say, well then, it's also obvious from such philosophy that it cannot actually understand itself. Now I would not deny anyone their delight in such an aperçu, but I wanted to express very clearly precisely what I have just been trying to bring out for you here, and I would ask you to take what I am saying as an interpretation of that earlier claim. And perhaps you will also see here that such claims are not actually aperçus, although they may initially strike you like that, and not merely pointed remarks either, for they occupy a very precise place within a continuous line of thought. For I wanted to say that actually only those thoughts are true which communicate with other thoughts by virtue of their own intrinsic gravity, while those thoughts are not true which are captured in a superficial general concept, which are merely classified and subsumed under an abstract universal, and thus can already only be determined as a particular case or mere example of a universal, whereby they naturally lose the very salt which makes knowledge into genuine knowledge in the first place. If I may perhaps use an analogy from literature to suggest what I mean by that distinctive labyrinthine character of knowledge which seems to me to be quite indispensable today for knowledge which really is such, knowledge which is interconnected but not systematic, then I believe that Kafka's novels, or indeed Kafka's work as a whole, actually possess in this regard a very precise epistemological function, while I may also note in passing, for those of you with a specific interest in literature, that Kafka's works, by virtue of their close affinity to parables, cannot be assimilated into the category of works of art. What I mean is that, if you read Kafka attentively, you will not be able to shake off the feeling that all these novels and stories communicate with one another in some kind of way, and this not on account of the single personality that supposedly stands behind them, or of a single pervasive mood, and in Kafka's honor we should point out right away that there is no such thing as a mood in his works, or even of some worldview they allegedly contain. For these novels are far too significant in themselves even to think of expressing that kind of content. This is all so much nonsense, the sort of thing you can read in the wake of Brode and Schoeps, for example. What we actually encounter, on the contrary, is a remarkably coherent and internally connected world which nonetheless eludes any attempt to grasp it as a unity, and which appears in a multiplicity of facets to which this thought returns again and again. And it is this labyrinthine element alone which allows knowledge to address the infinite character of living experience without either truncating it or blindly submitting to it, and which represents one of the impulses of the great form of the novel generally. And if we wish to write a logic, an epistemology, of the great novels, which God knows would be an important thing worth doing, then we could also discover a labyrinthine form of communication between particulars in the work of Balzac, which is very similar to that which I have pointed out in Kafka. And if I may introduce a completely different kind of writer from our own time here, then I would say that the work of Hermita von Diderot in its general structure is entirely pervaded by this labyrinthine character. Allow me simply to add here that this labyrinthine dimension indeed has something essentially to do with the structure of society as the ultimate object in question, and also as the ultimate constitutive subject of knowledge itself, for in fact we live in a society in which everything effectively communicates with everything else in a specific functional context, but where this intercommunicative context itself is in a certain sense irrational, that is to say, is by no means transparent. for it manifests itself in a particular kind of compulsion where one thing finds its way to another without the overall concept of the whole, the system which everything obeys, ever clearly revealing itself as such. What I mean is that our thoughts, without reflecting upon themselves in terms of their universal determinacy, are necessarily driven beyond themselves and almost always lose what they actually intend by allowing themselves to be reduced to a generic universal concept. I have already spoken about the concept of intuition in extremely critical terms at an earlier point in these lectures. If the notion of insight is to tell us anything over and beyond the purely subjective character of particular kinds of thought, if insight is to mean more than the fact that we just suddenly see something, then I would say that it always actually signifies just this moment when a thought is not produced on the basis of the relevant abstract generic concept, but where it is related, I would almost say, as an individual thought to a concrete object, while also pointing beyond itself and releasing the power which allows the individual moments to hang together in their subcutaneous and actually hidden structure. But I would now like to turn to the concept of system which is effectively implied by Descartes' axiom of completeness. And the first thing I would like to say to you, in order to bring the discussion regarding the concept of system in relation to its contemporary form, its contemporary manifestation, is that the philosophical conception of system itself, in terms of its inner structure, has already undergone decisive historical change. And I think it would be well worth investigating the various transformations to which the concept of system itself has been subjected. I don't exactly want to begin with Adam and Eve, and will therefore restrict myself here to modern philosophy, to the history of philosophy since Kant. And in this context it looks as if what the concept of system is basically meant to do, in the face of the sheer multiplicity and irrationality, the sheer opacity and contingency of things, is precisely to secure the moment of unity. And this minimal but necessary unity of thought which can assert itself against this otherwise overwhelming sense of contingency is what precisely Kant understands by system. In those significant philosophies which developed in response to Kant, and in the most extreme degree in the philosophy of Hegel, who has inevitably furnished the thematic angle of orientation for these lectures, we find that the claim of systematicity is immeasurably extended in comparison to that starting point. For what we see here is ultimately an attempt to develop the entire abundance of reality itself, the abundance of everything that exists, out of the pure concept, in other words, out of spirit. And since this is posited in identity with spirit, since spirit generates everything out of itself, there is a sense in which spirit thereby also has everything at its core and is thereby the master of everything that it is. Thus everything now stands within, and nothing is left out of that complete context that was already postulated by Descartes. Yet this context, and this point reflects one of the deepest impulses of post-Kantian philosophy, is no longer the somewhat reified context which was conceived by Descartes in accordance with a definitely mathematical schema. For the context in question here, by contrast, is that of the self-production of the whole. In other words, the system is complete not in the sense of bringing everything that exists under a single denominator, as it were, but rather by attempting to produce everything out of itself, out of this Kantian point of unity, namely out of the synthesis of apperception, so that system is now the comprehensive totality of productive spirit which is certain of itself, or the native realm of truth as Hegelian philosophy describes it. Development, or a certain regressive movement, on the part of bourgeois thought, this also applies to the concept of system itself. In other words, once the original claim of identity philosophy had collapsed in the course of post-Hegelian thought, we find that the concept of system effectively goes to the dogs, if I may put it that way, for it now returns to what it was before, namely to being merely an organizational schema. Systematicity now means nothing but the attempt to classify everything as completely as possible, to leave nothing at all out, and in the end, as we can typically see in the contemporary situation, the concept of philosophical system or the system provided by each individual science in fact just becomes a mold or frame, as it were, for administrative purposes, a procedural outline, in short a schema, in which everything that could possibly come before the bureaucrats of thought will find its appointed place in order to be efficiently dealt with. In our next session we shall say more about this specific development, and especially about the characteristic problems, the philosophical problems, which this poses for dialectical thought, and in this connection we shall also give particular attention to the now popular notion of a frame of reference. Lecture 7.